Welcome to today's episode of Ancient Mysteries Unveiled. Picture this. You're standing in the vast African savanna 900,000 years ago. The landscape stretches endlessly before you, golden grasslands broken by scattered acacia trees, their thorny branches reaching toward an increasingly hostile sky. But something is terribly wrong. Where you should see thriving groups of our early ancestors, perhaps dozens of families working together, crafting tools, sharing knowledge, you find only silence. What if I told you that at this very moment in our planet's history, humanity balanced on a knife's edge? What if our entire species, every single one of us alive today, descended from a group so small they could have fit inside a modern sports stadium? What if 99% of all human ancestors had simply vanished? This isn't science fiction. This is the most shocking discovery in human evolution, a near-extinction event so devastating that it rewrote the very DNA of our species. Scientists have discovered that around 930,000 years ago, human ancestors went through a severe population bottleneck, with only about 1,280 breeding individuals surviving for approximately 117,000 years. For comparison, there are more people in most small towns today than comprise the entire breeding population of our ancestors during this catastrophic period. How did they survive? What caused this mass extinction? And most importantly, how did this brush with oblivion shape everything about who we are today? The answers will challenge everything you thought you knew about human evolution. Chapter 1. The Genetic Time Bomb Discovery. In a sterile laboratory in Beijing, Dr. Haiping Li stared at computer screens filled with genetic sequences that would rewrite human history. It was 2023, and cutting-edge technology was about to reveal a secret hidden in our DNA for nearly 1 million years. The research team had developed a new methodology called FitCol, which allowed them to reconstruct ancient population dynamics using genetic data from over 3,200 present-day humans. Think of DNA as a history book written in a language we're only now learning to read fluently. Every person carries within their genes the story of their ancestors, not just from recent generations, but stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Like rings in a tree trunk, genetic mutations accumulate over time in predictable patterns, creating a molecular clock that scientists can read backwards through history. The researchers' method allowed them to reconstruct ancient population dynamics on the basis of genetic data from present-day humans. By constructing a complex family tree of genes, the team was able to examine the finer branches of the tree with greater precision, identifying significant evolutionary events. The analysis revealed numbers that initially seemed impossible. Dr. Yishuan Pan, who co-authored the research, says, "The novel finding opens a new field in human evolution by raising many new questions." But the most shocking revelation wasn't just the severity of the population crash, it was how long it lasted. This wasn't a brief catastrophe lasting a few generations. It persisted for approximately 117,000 years. To understand this timescale, consider that all of recorded human history, from the earliest writing systems to today's, spans only about 5,000 years. The population bottleneck our ancestors endured lasted 23 times longer than all of human civilization combined. Imagine your species reduced to the population of a small town, isolated and struggling to survive for over 100,000 years, while the world around you became increasingly hostile. The discovery overturned decades of assumptions about human evolution. Previously, scientists believed our ancestral populations had remained relatively stable, with gradual changes occurring over millions of years. The idea that humanity had come within a whisper of extinction was revolutionary and controversial. Joshua Aki, an evolutionary geneticist at Princeton University who was not involved with the work, noted that while there may be some fine-tuning of the exact time frame and severity, the evidence of a severe bottleneck seems pretty compelling. However, not all scientists were convinced. Janet Kelso, a computational biologist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, is skeptical. She notes that the genetic signal for the bottleneck is strongest only in present-day African populations, and not in people who today live outside Africa, which suggests the bottleneck might have only affected some ancestral populations. This discovery came at a time when advanced genetic analysis was revolutionizing our understanding of human evolution. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, had given scientists the tools to peer deeper into our genetic past than ever before. But it took another 2 decades of technological advancement to develop the computational power and analytical methods needed to detect such ancient population events. The methodology behind this discovery represents a quantum leap in paleogenomics, the study of ancient genetics. Unlike traditional paleontology, which relies on finding physical fossils, this approach uses the fossils embedded in our own DNA. Every person alive today carries genetic evidence of this ancient catastrophe in their cells. The implications were staggering. If accurate, this meant that up to 2/3 of genetic diversity was lost during the bottleneck. This loss of genetic diversity would have had profound effects on human evolution, potentially driving the development of key characteristics that define modern humans, including our large brains and unique cognitive abilities. The research team knew they had uncovered something extraordinary, but they also understood the controversial nature of their findings. The scientific community would demand rigorous validation, additional evidence, and alternative explanations. The stakes couldn't be higher. They were essentially rewriting the story of human survival and proposing that we are all descendants of a tiny group that somehow persevered through humanity's darkest hour. As news of the discovery spread through the scientific community, it raised profound questions about human resilience, adaptation, and the forces that shaped our species. If such a small population could survive and eventually give rise to the billions of humans alive today, what does that tell us about the remarkable tenacity of our ancestors? And what caused such a devastating population crash in the first place? Chapter 2. When the Earth turned against us 900,000 years ago, Earth was a planet in transition, locked in the grip of one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history. The early to middle Pleistocene transition was reshaping the world, and our ancestors found themselves caught in the crosshairs of forces beyond their comprehension or control. The end of the early Pleistocene is marked by the mid-Pleistocene transition, with the cyclicity of glacial cycles changing from 41,000-year cycles to asymmetric 100,000-year cycles, making the climate variation more extreme. Picture a world where climate patterns that had governed life for millions of years suddenly became unpredictable and hostile. The transition wasn't just about temperature. It was about the fundamental reorganization of Earth's climate systems. The duration and severity of the glacial periods increased during this period, with a particularly sharp change occurring between 900,000 and 600,000 years ago. This period marked the beginning of more intense and longer-lasting ice ages, with profound implications for life on Earth. Imagine living in a world where the rules of survival kept changing. For millions of years, early human ancestors had adapted to predictable patterns of wet and dry seasons, understanding when rains would come, when rivers would flow, when plants would bear fruit. But during this transition period, those patterns collapsed. Seasons became unreliable. Decades-long droughts replaced annual dry periods, and the very landscape began to transform. The ice sheets of the northern hemisphere were growing larger and more persistent than ever before. At their peak, ice covered the northern parts of North America, Europe, and Asia, and the climate fluctuations also caused major changes in vegetation and animal habitats. But the effects weren't limited to the ice-covered regions. The expanding ice sheets locked up vast amounts of water, causing sea levels to drop dramatically and altering ocean currents worldwide. These changes triggered a cascade of environmental disruptions that reached deep into Africa, where our ancestors were struggling to survive. The growing ice sheets altered global wind patterns, shifting the monsoons that brought life-giving rains to much of the continent. Areas that had been lush woodlands and grasslands for millions of years began to dry out, becoming harsh, semi-arid landscapes where survival required entirely new strategies. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was punctuated by periods of rapid, catastrophic change. Volcanic activity increased during this period, with massive eruptions spewing ash into the atmosphere and temporarily blocking sunlight. These volcanic winters could last for years, causing additional cooling and disrupting plant growth across vast regions. Ocean temperatures plummeted as the ice sheets expanded. According to the study, an estimated 65.85% of current genetic diversity may have been lost due to this bottleneck. The loss in genetic diversity prolonged a period of minimal numbers of humans who could successfully breed and was a major threat to the species. The cooling oceans disrupted marine ecosystems, affecting rainfall patterns and reducing the productivity of coastal environments where early humans often sought food. The atmospheric composition itself was changing. Carbon dioxide levels, which had remained relatively stable for millions of years, began to fluctuate dramatically. A gradual lowering of atmospheric CO2 and regolith removal are essential to reproduce the evolution of climate variability over the Quaternary. The long-term CO2 decrease leads to the initiation of Northern Hemisphere glaciation and an increase in the amplitude of glacial-interglacial variations. For early humans in Africa, these changes meant facing challenges their species had never encountered. Water sources that had sustained communities for generations began to dry up. The migration routes of animals they hunted changed unpredictably as species fled toward remaining refugia. Plant foods became scarcer as forests shrank and grasslands turned to scrubland. The psychological impact on early human communities would have been profound. These weren't people with scientific understanding of climate change. They were small groups trying to make sense of a world that seemed to be actively working against their survival. Imagine the terror of watching familiar landscapes transform into alien environments, of seeing the animals and plants your people had depended on for millennia simply disappear. Traditional knowledge, passed down through generations, suddenly became obsolete. The seasonal indicators that told communities when to move, when to gather, when to hunt, no longer applied. Weather patterns that had been reliable for thousands of years became chaotic and unpredictable. Rivers changed course or dried up entirely. Forests died and were replaced by scrubland or desert. The stress on early human populations would have been enormous. Groups that had been neighbors for generations might suddenly find themselves competing for the same dwindling resources. Trade networks that had connected distant communities collapsed as travel routes became impassable or as the goods being traded became unavailable. But perhaps most challenging of all was the sheer duration of these changes. This wasn't a brief crisis that communities could weather by drawing on stored resources or temporary adaptations. The hostile conditions persisted for tens of thousands of years, longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Generation after generation was born into a world of scarcity and uncertainty, with no memory of the more abundant times that had existed before. The archaeological evidence from this period is sparse, but what exists tells a story of human populations under extreme pressure. Tool technologies show signs of innovation born from desperation, new techniques for extracting nutrition from previously inedible plants, more efficient hunting methods for scarce game, improved ways of finding and storing water. Some areas of Africa may have remained habitable during this period, serving as refugia where small populations of humans could survive. These would have been places with reliable water sources, perhaps around major lakes or rivers, or in highlands where rainfall patterns remained more predictable. But even these refugia would have been crowded and resource-poor compared to the vast territories early humans had previously occupied. The environmental pressures during this period weren't just about survival. They were about the kind of survival that would shape human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years to come. The characteristics that allowed some groups to persist through this bottleneck: intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, tool use, became magnified in the human genome. In a very real sense, the hostile environment of 900,000 years ago was sculpting the traits that would define our species. Chapter 3: The Great African Drying. As global ice sheets expanded across the northern continents, Africa, the cradle of human evolution, began to experience one of the most severe drying periods in its geological history. The continent that had nurtured human development for millions of years was transforming into a hostile, arid landscape that would push our ancestors to the very brink of extinction. The mechanism behind this transformation was both simple and devastating. In glacial periods, the sea level would drop by up to 120 meters, 390 feet, lower than today during peak glaciation, exposing large areas of the present continental shelf as dry land. But the effects went far beyond just lower sea levels. The massive ice sheets in the north were fundamentally altering Earth's atmospheric circulation patterns. Imagine Africa 900,000 years ago as a continent caught between two hostile forces. To the north, expanding ice sheets were creating high-pressure systems that pushed life-giving monsoons away from the continent. To the south, cooling oceans were reducing evaporation and the formation of rain-bearing clouds. Africa was being squeezed in a climatic vice that would persist for over 100,000 years. The monsoon systems that had brought seasonal rains to much of the continent for millions of years began to weaken and shift. These weren't just minor adjustments; entire weather patterns that had sustained ecosystems since before humans existed were collapsing. Areas that had received reliable annual rainfall found themselves facing decade-long droughts. Rivers that had never dried up in human memory began to fail. Ice Age conditions were also drier than today. Because most of the water on Earth's surface was ice, there was little precipitation. Rainfall was about half of current levels. This global reduction in precipitation hit Africa particularly hard because the continent was already experiencing disrupted weather patterns due to the altered atmospheric circulation. The transformation began in the marginal areas regions that had always been somewhat dry but had supported sparse populations of early humans. As rainfall decreased, these areas became uninhabitable first. But the drying didn't stop there. It crept inexorably into the heart of previously lush regions, turning woodlands into grasslands, grasslands into scrublands, and scrublands into deserts. Lake systems that had existed for millions of years began to shrink dramatically. Lake Chad, which during wetter periods had been larger than the Caspian Sea, contracted to a fraction of its former size. The Great Lakes of the Rift Valley, which had served as oases in an increasingly dry landscape, saw their water levels drop by hundreds of feet. Springs that had bubbled up from underground aquifers for millennia began to dry up as water tables fell. The vegetation changes were particularly catastrophic for early human populations. Forests that had provided fruits, nuts, and medicinal plants began to die back. The woodland savannas where early humans had thrived, environments that offered both the resources of trees and the open spaces for hunting, were replaced by sparse grasslands with scattered, struggling trees. Animal populations, which early humans depended on for protein, began to collapse or migrate away from their traditional ranges. Large herbivores like elephants, hippos, and various antelope species either died out in many regions or concentrated around the few remaining water sources, making hunting both more dangerous and less reliable. The megafauna that had roamed African landscapes for millions of years began to disappear. Plant foods, which likely made up the majority of early human diets, became increasingly scarce and unpredictable. Seasonal fruits and nuts that had provided reliable nutrition were no longer available in many areas. Tubers and roots, which could be stored for lean times, became harder to find as soil conditions deteriorated and plants struggled to survive. The effects on human populations were devastating and multifaceted. Groups that had maintained stable territories for generations found themselves forced to become nomadic, constantly searching for resources. This nomadism increased conflict between groups as traditional territorial boundaries broke down and everyone competed for the same limited resources. Water became the most precious commodity. Communities that had previously settled near rivers or lakes found themselves having to travel ever greater distances to find water. Some groups may have been forced to survive on the moisture from plants or to develop new techniques for finding underground water sources. The knowledge of where to find water during dry seasons became literally life or death information. Food storage and preservation became critical skills. Groups that could successfully store water and food during brief wet periods had a significant survival advantage. This may have driven innovations in technology, new types of containers, better methods of food preservation, more efficient tools for processing tough, drought-resistant plants. The social impacts were equally severe. In times of abundance, early human groups could afford to be generous with resources and knowledge. But as resources became scarce, cooperation became more difficult. Some groups may have become more aggressive, raiding others for resources. Others may have become more isolated, hoarding their knowledge and defending their territories fiercely. The psychological stress of living through such conditions would have been enormous. Early humans would have witnessed landscapes they had known since childhood transform into alien environments. Elders would have told stories of green, abundant lands that younger generations would never see. The accumulated environmental knowledge of countless generations would have become increasingly obsolete as conditions continued to worsen. Yet within this crisis lay the seeds of evolutionary change. Groups that survived were those that could adapt most effectively to the new conditions. This might have meant developing better tools for processing tough, fibrous plants. It could have involved learning to exploit new types of environments, perhaps becoming more effective at hunting in open grasslands or learning to find resources in mountainous areas where conditions remained somewhat more favorable. The genetic bottleneck that occurred during this period was not just about population numbers, it was about which populations survived. The groups that made it through this catastrophic drying would have been those with the most effective adaptations to arid conditions. Their genes, their cultural knowledge, and their behavioral traits would have become the foundation for all future human evolution. Some regions of Africa may have served as refugia during this period, places where rainfall patterns remained somewhat more reliable or where geological features provided access to groundwater. These refugia would have been crowded with the remnants of populations from across the continent, creating intense competition, but also opportunities for the exchange of genes and knowledge. The Great African Drying was more than just an environmental crisis. It was an evolutionary filter that determined which human lineages would survive to become the ancestors of everyone alive today. The severity and duration of this crisis helps explain why the genetic bottleneck was so extreme and why it lasted for so many tens of thousands of years. Chapter 4: Anatomy of a Species on the Brink. When we imagine our ancestors struggling through the population bottleneck of 900,000 years ago, we must understand that these were not modern humans, but an earlier species with both similarities to and crucial differences from Homo sapiens. These were likely Homo erectus or early Homo heidelbergensis populations, beings who possessed remarkable intelligence and adaptability, yet faced the greatest challenge any human lineage has ever encountered. Early African Homo erectus fossils, sometimes called Homo ergaster, are the oldest known early humans to have possessed modern human-like body proportions with relatively elongated legs and shorter arms compared to the size of the torso. Picture individuals standing between 5 and 6 feet tall, with long, powerful legs adapted for covering vast distances on foot. Their bodies were built for endurance, with features that suggest they were already accomplished long-distance travelers. The skull of these early humans tells a fascinating story of a species in transition. The typical skull has a pronounced brow ridge, a protruding jaw, and large teeth. The bones are much thicker than in modern humans. Their brains, while smaller than ours, were already significantly larger than their predecessors. With the arrival of Homo erectus and Homo ergaster in the fossil record, cranial capacity had doubled to 850 cubic centimeters. These were unprimitive beings stumbling through a hostile world. They were sophisticated hunters and gatherers with complex tool technologies and social structures. The appearance of Homo erectus in the fossil record is often associated with the earliest hand axes, the first major innovation in stone tool technology. They had already mastered fire, one of humanity's greatest technological achievements, giving them the ability to cook food, extend their waking hours, and survive in colder climates. But despite their remarkable capabilities, these populations faced a crisis that would test every aspect of their biology and behavior. The effective breeding population of 1,280 individuals represents an extraordinarily small gene pool. To understand the implications, consider that geneticists today recommend maintaining populations of at least 10,000 individuals to preserve genetic diversity in endangered species. Our ancestors were surviving with barely 1/10 of that number. This tiny population size would have created immediate biological challenges. In small populations, inbreeding becomes inevitable, leading to reduced fertility, increased susceptibility to disease, and higher infant mortality rates. The researchers think this had a big impact on the evolution of humans. So they estimate around 98.7% of the human ancestor population was lost. And during this time, there were genetic changes that they've seen. There's chromosomes that merged together in this period. The social structure of these surviving groups would have been unlike anything we see in human societies today. With only 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across potentially vast areas of Africa, individual groups might have consisted of no more than 20 to 50 people. These weren't just families, they were entire genetic lineages compressed into tiny, isolated communities that might have had little or no contact with other human groups for generations. Communication between these scattered groups would have been critically important for genetic diversity, but also extremely dangerous and difficult. Individuals would have had to travel hundreds or thousands of miles across increasingly hostile terrain to find potential mates outside their immediate family group. The knowledge of where other groups might be found would have been precious information, passed down through generations and carefully guarded. The physical demands on these populations were extraordinary. Living in an increasingly arid environment meant they had to be highly mobile, constantly searching for water and food. Their bodies, already adapted for long-distance travel, would have been pushed to their limits. Individuals who couldn't keep up with the group's movements would have faced abandonment and death. Nutritional stress would have been constant. Some of the potential reasons behind this population drop are mostly related to extremes in climate. Temperatures changed, severe droughts persisted, and food sources may have dwindled as animals like mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths went extinct. The disappearance of large game animals meant groups had to develop new hunting strategies, focusing on smaller, more elusive prey, or learning to subsist on previously underutilized plant foods. The cognitive demands of survival during this period may have actually accelerated human brain evolution. Groups needed to remember the locations of seasonal water sources across vast territories, track the movements of migrating animals, identify edible plants in unfamiliar environments, and constantly adapt their survival strategies as conditions changed. The individuals with the best memories, the greatest problem-solving abilities, and the most innovative thinking would have had the highest chances of survival. Social cooperation became more critical than ever before. In small groups, where every individual was essential for survival, the ability to work together effectively could mean the difference between life and death. Sharing food, caring for the sick and injured, and collectively defending against predators required levels of trust and coordination that may have driven the evolution of enhanced social cognition. Tool technology during this period shows evidence of innovation born from necessity. Archaeological evidence suggests that tool-making techniques became more sophisticated and specialized as groups adapted to new environments and challenges. The ability to create and maintain tools became not just advantageous, but essential for survival. Child rearing would have presented unique challenges in these tiny populations. Every child represented a precious genetic resource, but also a tremendous burden on groups with limited resources. The extended dependency period that characterizes human childhood would have been even more costly during this crisis. Mothers would have needed extraordinary support from their communities to raise children successfully. The role of elders in these communities would have been particularly important. In a world where traditional knowledge was constantly being challenged by changing conditions, the accumulated wisdom of older individuals, their memories of different environments, their knowledge of alternative food sources, their understanding of weather patterns would have been invaluable for group survival. Disease outbreaks in such small, isolated populations would have been catastrophic. A single epidemic could have wiped out an entire genetic lineage. The groups that survived may have been those with either natural resistance to common diseases or the behavioral practices that minimize disease transmission. The mating strategies during this period would have been complex and carefully managed. With such small population sizes, every reproductive decision would have had implications for the genetic health of the group. Communities would have needed to balance the benefits of genetic diversity against the practical difficulties of finding mates from other groups. The mental health impacts of living through such a prolonged crisis are difficult to imagine. Generation after generation would have been born into a world of scarcity and uncertainty. The stress of constant survival challenges, the grief of losing community members to starvation or disease, and the psychological burden of maintaining hope in seemingly hopeless circumstances would have required remarkable resilience. Yet it was precisely these extreme conditions that forged the characteristics we associate with human nature today. The intelligence, adaptability, social cooperation, and technological innovation that allowed these small populations to survive became the foundation for all subsequent human evolution. Every person alive today carries the genetic legacy of these remarkable survivors who refused to surrender in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Chapter 5. The Fossil Records. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence supporting the population bottleneck theory lies not in what we have found, but in what we haven't found. He says that the fossil record in Africa and Eurasia between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago is patchy, and that the discovery of this bottleneck may explain the chronological gap. This mysterious absence of human fossils from precisely the period when the genetic analysis suggests our ancestors nearly went extinct provides powerful, if silent, testimony to one of the most dramatic events in human evolutionary history. To understand the significance of this gap, we need to appreciate how abundant human fossils are from the periods immediately before and after the bottleneck. The early Pleistocene, from about 2 million to 1 million years ago, has yielded numerous important hominin fossils across Africa and beyond. Similarly, the Middle Pleistocene, from about 700,000 years ago onward, is rich with evidence of human occupation and evolution. But then, Like a sudden silence in a symphony, the fossil record becomes eerily quiet during the crucial period of 950,000 to 650,000 years ago. The gap in the African and Eurasian fossil records can be explained by this bottleneck in the early Stone Age as chronologically, said Dr. Giorgio Manzi, an anthropologist at Sapienza University of Rome. It coincides with this proposed time period of significant loss of fossil evidence. This gap isn't simply a matter of poor preservation or insufficient exploration. Paleontologists have been actively searching for fossils from this period for decades, knowing that it represents a crucial time in human evolution. The absence of finds from this era, despite intensive searching, suggests that there simply were not enough humans living during this period to leave behind the kind of fossil record we see in other eras. Consider the mathematics of fossilization. Under the best circumstances, only a tiny fraction of individuals who die ever become fossils. The process requires very specific conditions: rapid burial, the right chemical environment, protection from scavengers and decay. For a population of 100,000 individuals spread across Africa, we might expect to find dozens or even hundreds of fossils from any given 50,000-year period. But for a population of just 1,280 individuals, the chances of any individual becoming a fossil drop dramatically. The scattered nature of the surviving population would have made fossilization even less likely. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum in London, who wrote a related perspective, says he was intrigued by the tiny size of the population. This would imply that it occupied a very localized area with good social cohesion for it to survive. He says, "Small, mobile groups constantly moving in search of resources would have been less likely to die in places where fossilization could occur." The environmental conditions during the bottleneck period would have been particularly hostile to fossil preservation. They argue that a major factor may have been extreme cooling that began around 900,000 years ago, according to geologic evidence. This cooling period coincided with severe drought in Africa and the decline of other species that human ancestors may have used as a food source. Droughts mean fewer lakes and rivers where bodies might be rapidly buried in sediment. Harsh conditions mean higher rates of scavenging, with bones being scattered and destroyed before they could be preserved. Yet the absence of fossils tells us more than just population numbers. It suggests something about the survival strategies of our ancestors during this period. In earlier times, human fossils are often found at sites where groups lived for extended periods, processing tools, cooking food, and leaving behind middens of animal bones and discarded implements. The lack of such sites from the bottleneck period suggests our ancestors couldn't afford to stay in one place long enough to leave substantial archaeological traces. Some researchers have questioned whether the fossil gap is as complete as it appears. Nicholas Ashton, a Paleolithic archaeologist at the British Museum, not involved with the study, notes that numerous archaeological sites in Africa and Eurasia date to the period of the proposed bottleneck. That suggests that any population crash impacted only a limited group, perhaps in Africa, who may have been the ancestors of modern humans. This raises intriguing questions about what happened to human populations outside Africa during this period. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo erectus populations in Asia may have been less severely affected by the climate changes that devastated African populations. Sites in China and Indonesia show continuous occupation through this period, though the populations may have been small and struggling. The fossil evidence that does exist from this period is tantalizing but fragmentary. A few isolated teeth here, a skull fragment there, just enough to confirm that humans were present, but nowhere near the abundance we see in other periods. These sparse remains are like whispered messages from our ancestors, barely audible across the vast expanse of time. One of the most significant implications of the fossil gap is what it tells us about human geographic distribution during the bottleneck. Before this period, Human ancestors had already spread from Africa into Asia, establishing populations across much of the Old World. But the genetic evidence suggests that all modern human lineages trace back to the African survivors of the bottleneck. This means that any human populations that existed outside Africa during this period either went extinct or contributed so little to the modern gene pool that their genetic signatures have been lost. It is a sobering thought. Entire branches of the human family tree may have been pruned away during this catastrophic period, leaving no descendants to carry forward their unique adaptations and cultural innovations. The absence of fossils also makes it incredibly difficult to track the evolutionary changes that occurred during the bottleneck. We know from genetic analysis that important developments happened during this period. The fusion of chromosomes that gave modern humans our distinctive karyotype may have occurred during this time. But without fossils to provide physical evidence, we can only infer these changes from their genetic signatures. Archaeological evidence from the periods immediately before and after the gap shows clear technological progression. Before the bottleneck, we see the development of more sophisticated tool technologies and evidence of controlled fire use. After the gap, we see the emergence of even more advanced tool traditions and signs of increasingly complex social behavior. The bottleneck period itself remains a black box, hiding the innovations and adaptations that allowed our ancestors to survive. The missing fossil record also obscures our understanding of how human populations began to recover from the bottleneck. Did recovery happen gradually over tens of thousands of years, or were there sudden population explosions when conditions improved? Did the surviving populations remain in isolated refugia until conditions improved globally, or did they begin expanding and recolonizing empty territories while the crisis was still ongoing? Recent discoveries have begun to fill in small pieces of this puzzle. Every new fossil from this period is precious, offering glimpses into the lives of our ancestors during their darkest hour. These fossils often show evidence of nutritional stress, thinner bone cortex, signs of interrupted growth, dental indicators of periodic starvation. They paint a picture of populations living on the edge, surviving but barely thriving. The sites where fossils from this period are found often tell their own stories of hardship. Many are located near the few reliable water sources that remained during the drought period, ancient lake beds or spring sites where small groups of humans managed to survive. The associated animal fossils often show similar signs of stress, confirming that the environmental crisis affected entire ecosystems. As paleontologists continue to search for fossils from this crucial period, each new discovery helps fill in the picture of how our ancestors survived the worst crisis in human evolutionary history. The fossil record may be sparse, but it's slowly beginning to speak, telling us about the remarkable resilience and adaptability that carried our species through its darkest hour and laid the foundation for our eventual recovery and global expansion. Chapter 6. Survival in the smallest numbers. Imagine being part of a community so small that you personally know every human being capable of ensuring your species' survival. This was the reality for our ancestors 900,000 years ago, a population so tiny that everyone who would ever contribute to the future human gene pool could have gathered in a modern high school gymnasium. Understanding how they managed to survive and eventually recover from such impossibly small numbers reveals the most remarkable story of resilience in human evolutionary history. The mathematics of survival for such a small population are sobering. With only 1,280 breeding individuals, the effective population size was smaller than many critically endangered species today. Population geneticists generally consider 10,000 individuals to be the minimum viable population for long-term survival of large mammals. Our ancestors were operating with about 1/8 of that number, in conditions far more challenging than any modern conservation program faces. In populations this small, Every individual matters in ways that are difficult for us to comprehend in our modern world of billions. The loss of even a few individuals to disease, accident, or violence could have genetic repercussions lasting for generations. Every successful birth was a victory for the species. Every death was a potential genetic catastrophe. The survival strategies employed by these tiny communities would have been unlike anything seen in human societies before or since. Groups would have been small, probably no more than 20 to 30 individuals each, consisting of a few families bound together by necessity and kinship. But these weren't just social groups. They were genetic lifelines, each one carrying a precious portion of humanity's total genetic heritage. Finding mates would have been one of the most critical challenges facing these communities. In a population of 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across vast areas of Africa, locating genetically unrelated partners would have required extensive travel and communication networks. Young adults might have had to journey hundreds of miles across increasingly hostile terrain to find suitable mates outside their immediate family group. The social protocols governing mating and reproduction during this period would have been sophisticated and carefully managed. Communities would have needed detailed knowledge of their genetic relationships extending back multiple generations. The taboos against close inbreeding that exist in all human societies may have their origins in this period, when the genetic consequences of poor mating choices could affect the survival of entire lineages. Communication between groups would have been essential but dangerous. Maintaining contact across vast distances required individuals to serve as messengers, carrying information about resource availability, group movements, and potential mating partners. These messenger networks would have been lifelines connecting the scattered remnants of humanity, but they also represented enormous risks. Losing a messenger meant losing contact with potentially vital allies. The social structures within these tiny communities would have been remarkably egalitarian by necessity. In groups where every individual was essential for survival, traditional hierarchies based on strength or aggression would have been counterproductive. Instead, these societies would have valued cooperation, knowledge sharing, and collective decision-making. The survival of the group would have depended on maximizing the contributions of every member. Children in these communities would have faced unique challenges and opportunities. Every child represented both hope for the future and a tremendous burden on limited resources. The extended dependency period that characterizes human childhood would have been even more costly during this crisis. But children who survived would have received an incredibly rich education-intensive training in survival skills, detailed knowledge of their environment, and access to the accumulated wisdom of the entire community. The role of elderly individuals would have been particularly complex. On one hand, older people who could no longer contribute physically to the group's survival represented a drain on scarce resources. But on the other hand, they were repositories of irreplaceable knowledge, memories of environmental conditions, locations of seasonal resources, techniques for surviving difficult periods. The decisions about how to care for elderly community members would have been heartbreaking but necessary calculations of group survival. Food sharing and resource allocation would have required careful management and strong social norms. In times of abundance, groups could afford to be generous. But during the frequent periods of scarcity that characterized this era, every calorie would have been precious. The social mechanisms for ensuring fair distribution of food while maintaining group cohesion would have been critical for survival. The psychological resilience required to survive in such conditions is almost impossible to imagine. Generation after generation would have been born into a world of constant uncertainty and scarcity. The stress of knowing that their entire species balanced on the edge of extinction would have been overwhelming. Yet somehow, these communities maintained not just their physical survival, but their humanity, their capacity for cooperation, innovation, and hope. Innovation and adaptation would have been constant requirements for survival. As environmental conditions changed and traditional resources became unavailable, groups would have needed to continuously develop new technologies and techniques. The individuals who could think creatively, solve problems, and develop new approaches would have been invaluable to their communities. Conflict resolution within these tiny groups would have been critical. In larger populations, individuals who couldn't get along could simply avoid each other or join different groups. But in communities of 20 to 30 people, everyone had to work together or the entire group could fail. The social skills needed to mediate disputes, manage personality conflicts, and maintain group cohesion would have been as important as any survival technology. The cultural transmission of knowledge would have been intense and comprehensive. With so few individuals to carry forward human knowledge and skills, every person would have needed to master multiple domains of expertise. There couldn't be specialists who only knew how to make tools or only understood plant foods. Everyone would have needed to be a generalist capable of multiple critical functions. Seasonal movements and territorial strategies would have been carefully planned and executed. Groups would have needed detailed knowledge of resource availability across vast areas, understanding not just where water and food could be found, but when they would be available and how long they might last. The timing of movements between locations would have been critical. Arrive too early and resources might not yet be available. Arrive too late and they might already be depleted. The development of storage technologies would have been crucial for surviving seasonal shortages. Groups that could effectively preserve food during abundant periods and store water for dry seasons would have had significant survival advantages. This may have driven innovations in container technologies, food preservation techniques, and cache management strategies. Risk management would have been a constant concern. Every decision where to camp, when to move, what foods to eat, how to respond to potential threats would have been evaluated in terms of its potential impact on group survival. The tolerance for risk would have been extremely low, with groups favoring conservative strategies that maximize their chances of avoiding catastrophic failures. Despite the overwhelming challenges, these tiny populations possessed advantages that larger groups might have lacked. Their small size meant they could move quickly when necessary, exploit marginal resources that couldn't support larger groups, and maintain social cohesion more easily. They were, in effect, the ultimate survivors, stripped down to the essential elements needed for human persistence. The fact that we exist today is testament to the remarkable success of these survival strategies. Every person alive carries in their genes the legacy of these incredibly small populations that refuse to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Their survival wasn't just a matter of luck, it was the result of intelligence, cooperation, innovation, and an extraordinary determination to persist against all odds. Chapter 7. The Chromosome Fusion Mystery Hidden. Within the genetic catastrophe of 900,000 years ago lies one of the most significant evolutionary events in human history. An event so subtle that it went unnoticed until modern genetic analysis revealed its crucial importance. During the darkest period of human survival, when our ancestors numbered fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals, something remarkable happened at the cellular level that would distinguish humans from all other primates forever. As the authors of the bottleneck study point out, ancestral hominins had 48 chromosomes, the same as chimpanzees and gorillas. At some stage, probably around the time of the proposed bottleneck, 2 of these fused to become our modern chromosome 2, leaving modern humans with 46 chromosomes. This chromosomal fusion wasn't just a genetic curiosity, it may have been one of the key evolutionary events that defined what it means to be human. To understand the significance of this event, we need to grasp what chromosomes are and why their number and structure matter. Chromosomes are the packages that contain our genetic material, like volumes in a library that hold all the information needed to build and maintain a complex organism. Most great apes have 48 chromosomes, 24 pairs. but humans have only 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. For decades, this difference puzzled scientists. Why would humans have fewer chromosomes than their closest evolutionary relatives? The answer came from detailed analysis of human chromosome 2, which showed clear evidence of being formed by the fusion of two separate chromosomes that still exist independently in other great apes. The fusion site is still visible in modern humans as a distinctive genetic signature, telomeric sequences in the middle of the chromosome where the two original chromosomes join together. The timing of this fusion event aligns remarkably with the population bottleneck discovered through genetic analysis. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence of one of the most dramatic evolutionary bottlenecks in human history, creating the conditions for a major genetic reorganization that would affect every human who would ever live. Chromosomal fusions are rare events that typically occur during meiosis, the process by which reproductive cells are formed. When it happens, it creates individuals whose chromosome number differs from their parents and siblings. In most cases, such individuals have difficulty reproducing because their chromosomes can't pair properly during meiosis, leading to infertility or sterile offspring. But the population bottleneck created unique conditions that allowed this normally disadvantageous mutation to spread through the entire human population. With only 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across Africa, the genetic isolation of small groups meant that unusual genetic variants could become established through founder effects and genetic drift rather than being eliminated by natural selection. Imagine a small group of perhaps 30 to 50 individuals struggling to survive in an increasingly harsh environment. If one or more members of this group carried the chromosomal fusion, and if this group became isolated from other human populations for extended periods, the fusion could spread through the entire group simply through inbreeding and random genetic drift. Over many generations, as populations remained small and isolated, the fusion could become fixed in the surviving human lineage. The genetic isolation created by the bottleneck would have been essential for this process. In large, connected populations, individuals with unusual chromosome numbers typically have reduced fertility, and their genetic variants are quickly eliminated. But in the tiny, isolated populations of 900,000 years ago, normal evolutionary pressures were suspended. Genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies due to small population size, became more important than natural selection. While it may have had minimal impact, it's also possible that this change limited interbreeding with other populations, contributing to them becoming reproductively isolated. This is one of the most intriguing aspects of the chromosome fusion. It may have served as a genetic barrier that helped establish the lineage that would eventually give rise to modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The fusion of these chromosomes didn't just change the number of chromosomes, it potentially affected how genes on those chromosomes were regulated and expressed. When two chromosomes fuse, the genes that were previously on separate chromosomes come under the influence of new regulatory sequences. This can lead to changes in gene expression patterns that might have contributed to the unique characteristics of the human lineage. Some researchers have suggested that the chromosomal fusion may have been associated with the evolution of larger brain size in humans. While the connection isn't direct, the reorganization of genetic material could have affected the regulation of genes involved in brain development. The timing of the fusion, coinciding with the bottleneck that also saw significant evolutionary changes in human ancestors, supports this possibility. The process by which the fusion became established in the human population would have taken many generations. Initially, individuals with the fusion would have had difficulty reproducing with individuals who still had the original 48 chromosome configuration. Their offspring would have had 47 chromosomes, an odd number that typically causes serious reproductive problems. But in the isolated populations created by the bottleneck, these reproductive barriers may have actually contributed to the formation of distinct breeding groups. Communities where the fusion became common would have been increasingly isolated from communities that retained the original chromosome configuration. Over time, this could have led to the evolution of separate populations with different chromosome numbers. The genetic analysis of modern human populations shows that everyone alive today carries the fused chromosome, indicating that all modern humans descend from the population where this fusion became established. This means that any human populations that retain the original 48 chromosome configuration either went extinct during the bottleneck period or were absorbed into the fusion-carrying population through interbreeding. The chromosome fusion also provides insight into the population dynamics during the recovery from the bottleneck. For the fusion to become universal in modern humans, the population carrying it must have been the one that expanded most successfully as conditions improved. This suggests that the fusion-carrying population may have had some advantage, whether biological, technological, or cultural, that allowed them to outcompete other surviving human groups. Modern genetic analysis has revealed additional details about the fusion event. The breakpoints where the two chromosomes joined show evidence of complex rearrangements that occurred over multiple generations. This suggests that the fusion wasn't a single, sudden event, but rather a process that unfolded over time as the fused chromosome was stabilized through natural selection. The fusion event also affected the genetic recombination patterns in humans. Recombination, the shuffling of genetic material during reproduction, occurs differently on the fused chromosome than it would have on the two separate chromosomes. This has subtle but important effects on human genetic diversity and the inheritance patterns of traits located on chromosome 2. Studying the chromosome fusion provides a unique window into the evolutionary processes that operated during the population bottleneck. It shows how extreme demographic events can create conditions for major genetic changes that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The fusion stands as a permanent genetic monument to one of the most challenging periods in human evolutionary history. The discovery of the chromosome fusion timing also validates the genetic methods used to detect the population bottleneck. When independent lines of evidence, population genetics and chromosomal analysis point to the same time period and the same evolutionary events, it strengthens confidence in both findings. Today, every human carries this genetic signature of our ancestors' survival through impossible odds. The fusion that occurred during humanity's darkest hour became a defining characteristic of our species, a molecular reminder that we are all descendants of a tiny population that refused to surrender to extinction. In a very real sense, the structure of our chromosomes tells the story of our species' greatest triumph over adversity. Chapter 8. Fire. Tools. In the harsh world of 900,000 years ago, survival depended not just on biological adaptation, but on the remarkable human capacity for innovation and tool use. As environmental conditions pushed our ancestors to the very edge of extinction, they responded with technological innovations that would prove crucial for their survival and lay the foundation for all future human cultural development. The earliest evidence of hearths, campfires, occurred during the time range of Homo erectus. While we have evidence that hearths were used for cooking and probably sharing food, they are likely to have been places for social interaction and also used for warmth and to keep away large predators. The control of fire wasn't just a technological achievement, it was a revolution that transformed human survival capabilities in fundamental ways. Imagine the difference fire made for small groups struggling to survive in an increasingly cold and hostile world. Beyond the obvious benefits of warmth and protection from predators, fire extended the usable hours in each day, allowing groups to remain active and productive after dark. This was particularly important for small populations where every hour of productivity could mean the difference between life and death. Cooking food with fire provided massive nutritional advantages that may have been crucial during the bottleneck period. Raw plant foods that were previously inedible or provided minimal nutrition could be transformed through cooking into valuable calorie sources. Tough, fibrous roots and tubers that had become more common as preferred foods disappeared could be rendered digestible through roasting. Meat could be preserved through smoking and drying, allowing groups to store protein for lean times. The social implications of fire were equally important for these tiny communities. Gathering around a fire provided a focal point for group activities, strengthening social bonds that were essential for collective survival. The warmth and light of a fire created a safe space where group members could engage in important cultural activities, tool-making, storytelling, planning, and the transmission of knowledge to younger generations. Fire also provided a powerful tool for landscape management. Controlled burning could be used to drive game animals, clear underbrush to make travel easier, and encourage the growth of useful plants. In an environment where resources were becoming increasingly scarce, the ability to actively manage and improve local ecosystems would have been invaluable. Tool technology during this period shows evidence of innovation born from necessity. Known as the Acheulean stone tool industry, it consisted of the creation of large cutting tools like hand axes and cleavers. Increased reliance on a broader set of tools may have helped Homo erectus survive during changing climates. These weren't simple implements, they were sophisticated, standardized tools that required considerable skill and planning to create. The hand axe, in particular, represents one of humanity's most successful technologies. These bifacially worked tools remained virtually unchanged for over 1 million years, suggesting they were near-perfect solutions to the challenges faced by early humans. During the bottleneck period, the ability to create and maintain these tools would have been essential for processing tough plant foods, butchering scarce game animals, and working with other materials. But the tools themselves tell only part of the story. The knowledge required to make them, understanding which stones to select, how to shape them through careful knapping, how to maintain sharp edges, represented a crucial cultural inheritance that had to be preserved and transmitted, even as populations dwindled to their smallest numbers. In communities of 20 to 30 people, losing even one skilled toolmaker could be catastrophic. The innovation pressure created by the bottleneck likely drove the development of new tool technologies and techniques. As traditional resources became unavailable, groups needed tools optimized for exploiting new types of foods and materials. This may have led to experimentation with different stone types, new knapping techniques, and tools designed for specific tasks, like processing drought-resistant plants or hunting smaller animals. Storage technologies would have been particularly important during this period. The ability to create containers for water and preserve food could mean the difference between surviving a drought and dying of thirst. Groups may have developed new techniques for working with organic materials, bark, hide, and plant fibers to create bags, water vessels, and food storage containers. The psychological importance of tool making and fire control cannot be overstated. For small groups facing seemingly impossible odds, the ability to transform their environment through technology provided both practical advantages and psychological benefits. Making tools and maintaining fires were tangible ways that individuals could contribute to group survival and maintain a sense of control over their circumstances. The transmission of technological knowledge became even more critical during the bottleneck period. With so few individuals carrying forward human cultural knowledge, Every person needed to master multiple technological domains. Children would have received intensive education in tool-making, fire management, and other survival technologies. The loss of knowledge due to individual deaths would have been a constant threat to group survival. Innovation in hunting strategies would have been necessary as large game animals became scarce. Groups may have developed new techniques for hunting. Smaller animals, such as improved projectile weapons, trap technologies, or coordinated group hunting strategies. The ability to successfully hunt fast, elusive prey would have provided crucial protein during periods when plant foods were insufficient. Weapon technology may have advanced during this period as competition for resources increased. Groups needed effective tools not just for hunting, but potentially for defending themselves and their resources from other desperate human communities. The development of spears, clubs, and other weapons would have been driven by both hunting needs and intergroup conflict. The maintenance and repair of tools became critical skills when resources for making new tools were scarce. Groups that could effectively maintain their equipment and extend the useful life of their tools would have had significant advantages. This may have led to innovations in tool hafting, sharpening techniques, and composite tool construction. Food processing technologies became increasingly important as diets shifted toward less palatable resources. The ability to remove toxins from plants, extract maximum nutrition from poor quality foods, and combine different ingredients to create nutritionally balanced meals would have been essential skills. Stone tools designed specifically for grinding, crushing, and processing plant foods may have become more common. The organization of tool production within communities would have required careful coordination. With everyone's time and energy at a premium, the allocation of labor for tool making needed to be efficient and strategic. Some individuals may have specialized in particular types of tool making, while others focused on raw material acquisition or tool maintenance. The procurement of raw materials for tool making presented unique challenges for mobile groups. Quality stone for tool making wasn't available everywhere, and groups needed to plan their movements to ensure access to necessary materials. This may have led to the development of trade networks between scattered groups, with high-quality stone being exchanged for other valuable resources. The symbolic and cultural aspects of tools may have become more important during this period of extreme stress. Tools weren't just functional objects. They were symbols of human ingenuity and cultural continuity. The act of making tools connected individuals to their ancestral traditions and provided hope for the future. The integration of fire and tool technologies created synergistic advantages that were greater than the sum of their parts. Fire-hardened wooden tools, heat-treated stone for easier knapping, and the use of fire in tool-making processes all enhanced the effectiveness of human technology. These integrated approaches to technology may have been crucial for surviving. The bottleneck period. The legacy of innovations developed during the bottleneck period extended far beyond immediate survival needs. The technological foundations laid during this crisis provided the basis for all subsequent human cultural development. The tools, techniques, and knowledge systems that allowed our ancestors to survive their darkest hour became the building blocks for the remarkable technological achievements that would follow as populations recovered and expanded. Chapter 9. The Great Recovery begins around 813,000 years ago. After more than 100,000 years of near extinction, something remarkable began to happen. The population of pre-humans began to swell again. How our ancestors managed to survive and what allowed them to flourish once more remains unclear, says Ziqian Hao, a population geneticist at the Shandong First Medical University and Shandong Academy of Medical Sciences in Jinan, and a co-author of the paper. But the genetic evidence clearly shows that this was the beginning of humanity's greatest comeback story. The recovery wasn't sudden. or dramatic. It was a gradual process that unfolded over tens of thousands of years. But for populations that had been reduced to their absolute minimum viable numbers, any increase represented a monumental achievement. Each successful generation, each new group that split off from parent populations, each expansion into previously uninhabitable territory, marked another step back from the brink of extinction. Understanding what triggered this recovery requires us to examine the complex interplay of climate change, technological innovation, and evolutionary adaptation that created new opportunities for human expansion. The harsh environmental conditions that had pushed human populations to the edge of extinction were beginning to shift, creating windows of opportunity that our ancestors were remarkably well positioned to exploit. Climate patterns around 813,000 years ago were showing signs of stabilization after the catastrophic fluctuations of the previous 100,000 years. While conditions remained challenging by modern standards, the extreme variability that had made long-term survival planning nearly impossible was beginning to moderate. Seasonal patterns became somewhat more predictable, allowing communities to plan movements and resource exploitation with greater confidence. The technological innovations developed during the bottleneck period now proved their worth. Groups that had mastered fire control, advanced tool-making, and efficient food processing techniques found themselves with significant advantages as new opportunities arose. The survival skills learned during the crisis became the foundation for expansion and growth when conditions improved. One of the most important factors in the recovery may have been the development of more sophisticated social organization. The extreme challenges of the bottleneck period had forced human communities to develop unprecedented levels of cooperation, communication, and collective problem-solving. These social innovations proved to be powerful tools for exploiting new opportunities and expanding into previously uninhabitable areas. The recovery process would have begun in the refugia, where human populations had managed to survive the worst of the crisis. These areas, probably located near reliable water sources or in regions with relatively stable microclimates, had supported small human populations through the bottleneck period. As conditions improved, these refugia became launching points for recodify of abandoned territories. Population growth during the early recovery period would have been slow and tentative. Groups that had been living at the very edge of survival for generations would have been cautious about expanding too quickly or taking unnecessary risks. The memory of the crisis, passed down through oral traditions, would have made communities reluctant to abandon proven survival strategies. The expansion process likely involved a combination of population growth within existing territories and the splitting off of daughter groups to explore new areas. As local populations grew beyond the carrying capacity of their refugia, some individuals would have been forced to venture into previously abandoned regions. These pioneer groups would have faced enormous risks, but their success or failure would have provided valuable information for future expansion attempts. The demographic mechanics of recovery from such a severe bottleneck would have been complex and fragile. With starting populations so small, even minor setbacks could have dramatically slowed or reversed the recovery process. Disease outbreaks, resource failures, or conflicts between groups could have quickly eliminated years or decades of population growth. The fact that recovery succeeded demonstrates the remarkable resilience of the surviving human lineages. The recodify of Africa during this period would have been a gradual process of exploration, settlement, and abandonment. Many attempts to establish new communities probably failed as groups encountered unexpected challenges or resource limitations. But successful settlements would have served as stepping stones for further expansion, creating a network of interconnected communities across the continent. environmental monitoring and prediction capabilities, developed during the bottleneck, became crucial tools for successful expansion. Groups needed to accurately assess the long-term viability of new territories before committing to permanent settlement. The ability to read environmental indicators, soil quality, water availability, climate patterns, and biological productivity determined which expansion attempts would succeed and which would fail. The role of innovation and experimentation in driving recovery cannot be overstated. As groups encountered new environments and challenges during expansion, they needed to adapt their technologies and strategies continuously. The innovative capacity that had been honed during the survival crisis became a powerful engine for cultural and technological development during the recovery period. Technological innovations continued to play a crucial role in the recovery process. The ability to exploit new types of environments required new tools and techniques. Groups expanding into different ecological zones would have needed to adapt their technologies to local conditions, driving further innovation and cultural development. The genetic implications of the recovery process were profound. As populations grew and expanded, the genetic bottleneck that had reduced human diversity began to ease. However, the effects of the crisis would remain permanently embedded in the human genome. The limited genetic diversity that characterizes modern human populations compared to other great apes is a direct result of this ancient bottleneck. Communication networks between expanding groups became increasingly important as populations spread across larger territories. The knowledge gained by pioneer groups about new areas, resources, and survival techniques needed to be shared with other communities. This may have led to the development of more sophisticated systems for long-distance communication and information exchange. The development of territorial management strategies became essential as human populations grew and spread. Groups needed to establish sustainable relationships with their environments that could support larger populations over longer periods. This required more sophisticated understanding of ecological cycles, resource management, and environmental stewardship than had been necessary during the survival-focused bottleneck period. Social stratification and specialization may have begun to emerge during the recovery period as communities grew larger and more stable. During the bottleneck, every individual needed to be a generalist capable of multiple survival functions. But as groups became larger and more secure, individuals could begin to specialize in particular skills or roles, leading to increased efficiency. An innovation. The psychological transformation from survival mode to growth mode would have been a significant challenge for communities emerging from the bottleneck. Generations that had known only scarcity and crisis suddenly found themselves in a world of expanding possibilities. This shift required new mental models, behavioral patterns, and cultural frameworks for understanding and responding to their changing circumstances. Resource sharing and cooperation strategies that had been essential for survival during the bottleneck needed to be modified for the recovery period. While cooperation remained important, growing populations and expanding territories created new dynamics around resource allocation, territorial rights, and intergroup relationships. The social and cultural changes that occurred during the recovery period laid the foundation for all subsequent human development. The cooperation skills, technological innovations, and adaptive strategies that had been developed during the crisis proved to be powerful tools for expansion and growth. In many ways, the bottleneck period had created a more capable and resilient human species. Resource management strategies developed during the crisis proved valuable during the recovery period. Groups that had learned to efficiently exploit marginal resources and maximize the productivity of small territories were well equipped to expand into new areas and establish sustainable communities. The conservation ethic born from extreme scarcity became a foundation for responsible resource use during periods of abundance. The recovery process wasn't uniform across all regions or populations. Some areas that had been completely abandoned during the bottleneck remained uninhabitable for thousands of years after the initial recovery began. Other regions saw rapid reconify as conditions improved. This uneven pattern of recovery created a complex mosaic of human settlement across Africa. Competition between expanding groups may have driven further innovation and cultural development. As human populations grew and territories became more crowded, groups needed to develop competitive advantages to secure access to the best resources. This may have accelerated the development of new technologies, social organizations, and cultural practices. The establishment of trade and exchange networks became possible as communities became more numerous and stable. Groups in different regions could specialize in particular resources or technologies, trading their surpluses for materials not available in their local areas. These early trade networks laid the foundation for the complex economic relationships that would characterize later human societies. Cultural transmission mechanisms became more elaborate as communities grew larger and more stable. The intensive one-on-one education that had characterized the bottleneck period could be supplemented with more formal systems of knowledge sharing. This allowed for the preservation and transmission of increasingly complex cultural knowledge across generations and between communities. The recovery period also saw the beginning of more complex territorial behaviors. As populations grew and good territories became more valuable, groups needed to develop systems for establishing and defending territorial claims. This may have led to the development of more sophisticated concepts of property, territorial boundaries, and resource rights. Risk assessment and management strategies evolved during the recovery as groups faced new types of challenges. While survival risks remained important, expansion risks, the dangers of overextending resources or moving into unsuitable territories, became equally significant. Communities needed to balance conservative survival strategies with the opportunities presented by expansion. The success of the recovery process validates the remarkable adaptations that had been developed during the bottleneck period. The fact that such a small population was able to not only survive, but eventually expand to recolonize much of Africa demonstrates the effectiveness of the survival strategies they had developed. By around 700,000 years ago, human populations had recovered sufficiently to begin showing up more regularly in the fossil record. The gap that had characterized the bottleneck period was ending, and the archaeological evidence shows increasing signs of human activity across Africa and beyond. The Great Recovery was well underway, setting the stage for the eventual expansion of human populations that would lead to the colonization of the entire planet. The recovery from the bottleneck represents one of the most remarkable comeback stories in the history of life on Earth. From a population of barely over 1,000 breeding individuals, humans not only survived but went on to become the most successful large mammal species on the planet. This recovery demonstrates the incredible resilience and adaptability that characterizes the human species, traits that were forged in the crucible of near-extinction and continue to define us today. Chapter 10. Echoes in Our DNA. Every person reading this carries within their cells the genetic fingerprints of humanity's brush with extinction 900,000 years ago. The population bottleneck that nearly wiped out our species left permanent signatures in our DNA markers that tell the story of survival, loss, and recovery that continues to influence human biology and behavior today. Our findings indicate that the severe bottleneck brought the ancestral human population close to extinction and completely reshaped present-day human genetic diversity. The authors write in the study, "This reshaping wasn't just a historical event. It fundamentally altered the genetic landscape of our species in ways that continue to affect every aspect of human biology, from our susceptibility to diseases, to our physical characteristics, and even our behavior patterns. The most obvious legacy of the bottleneck is the remarkably low genetic diversity that characterizes modern humans compared to other great apes. Compared with other living primates, contemporary humans have startlingly low genetic diversity. This isn't just an abstract scientific observation. It has real-world implications for human health, evolution, and survival as a species. To understand just how genetically similar humans are to each other, consider that any two humans, regardless of their geographic origin or apparent physical differences, share approximately 99.9% of their DNA. In contrast, chimpanzees from different populations in Africa show much greater genetic variation despite being confined to a much smaller geographic area. This low diversity is a direct result of the fact that all modern humans descend from the tiny population that survived the bottleneck. The loss of genetic diversity during the bottleneck had profound implications for human evolution. Genetic diversity provides the raw material for natural selection. The more variation exists in a population, the greater the potential for adaptation to new challenges. With reduced genetic diversity, human populations became more vulnerable to diseases, environmental changes, and other challenges that might have been manageable with a more diverse gene pool. However, the bottleneck also had some unexpected positive effects on human evolution. The extreme selective pressure of near-extinction may have accelerated the evolution of beneficial traits that helped our ancestors survive. The researchers estimate that the bottleneck may have driven the evolution of important features of modern humans, such as brain size. The intense selection for survival-relevant traits during this period may have rapid evolutionary changes that would, and have, occurred under normal circumstances. The geographic pattern of genetic diversity in modern human populations tells the story of our recovery from the bottleneck. African populations show the highest levels of genetic diversity, reflecting the fact that Africa was the center of human survival and the starting point for subsequent global expansion. As human populations spread out of Africa, they carried with them only a subset of the genetic diversity that had been rebuilt after the bottleneck. This pattern of decreasing genetic diversity with distance from Africa has important implications for understanding human populations today. Populations that are more genetically isolated or that descended from smaller founding groups show even less genetic diversity than would be expected from the bottleneck alone. This can affect everything from disease susceptibility to the effectiveness of medical treatments in different populations. The bottleneck's genetic legacy is particularly visible in our immune system genes. The genes that control immune responses show evidence of having gone through severe population restrictions, followed by rapid expansion and diversification. This pattern suggests that infectious diseases may have been major factors in the bottleneck, and that the survivors possessed immune system variants that provided protection against the pathogens of that era. Modern humans' relatively uniform blood types, compared to the diversity seen in other primates, also reflect the bottleneck's impact. The Abo blood group system, for example, shows patterns consistent with having been reduced to a very small number of variants during the crisis, then slowly rebuilding diversity as populations recovered and expanded. The genetic evidence also reveals insights into the mating patterns and social organization of our bottleneck ancestors. The patterns of genetic recombination and linkage in modern human genomes suggest that the surviving populations went through periods of very small effective population sizes, followed by rapid expansion. This is consistent with the scenario of small, isolated groups surviving in refugia before expanding when conditions improved. One of the most fascinating aspects of our genetic legacy from the bottleneck is how it may have influenced human behavioral evolution. The extreme social cooperation required for survival in tiny groups may have left genetic signatures that continue to influence human behavior today. Some researchers suggest that uniquely human traits like altruism, cooperation, and complex communication may have been enhanced during this period of extreme selective pressure. The bottleneck may also explain some puzzling aspects of human reproduction and development. Our species has unusually difficult childbirth compared to other primates, extended childhood dependency, and complex social structures around child-rearing. These characteristics, which seem disadvantageous from a survival perspective, may have been beneficial during the bottleneck when every individual was precious and intensive investment in offspring quality was more important than quantity. DNA repair mechanisms in humans also show evidence of having been under intense selective pressure, possibly during the bottleneck period. The genetic systems that protect against DNA damage and maintain genetic stability are particularly well developed in humans compared to other species. This may reflect the fact that in very small populations, genetic integrity becomes critically important for long-term survival. The timing of certain genetic changes in human evolution aligns remarkably well with the bottleneck period. The genetic evidence suggests that important regulatory changes affecting brain development, language capabilities, and social cognition occurred during or shortly after this time. This supports the idea that the extreme challenges of the bottleneck accelerated human cognitive evolution. Modern studies of human genetic diseases also reveal the bottleneck's influence. Many genetic disorders that affect humans show patterns consistent with having originated from mutations that became established in small populations during the bottleneck. Some beneficial genetic variants that protect against diseases may also have originated during this period when survival advantages would have been strongly selected for. The metabolic adaptations that characterize modern humans also bear the genetic signatures of the bottleneck period. Human metabolism shows remarkable efficiency in extracting energy from diverse food sources and storing energy during periods of abundance. These metabolic capabilities, which may seem excessive in our modern world of abundant food, made perfect sense when viewed as adaptations to the extreme nutritional stress experienced during the bottleneck. The genetic basis of human stress responses reveals another layer of the bottleneck's legacy. Modern humans possess sophisticated physiological systems for responding to acute stress and managing chronic adversity. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which controls stress hormone production, shows evidence of having been fine-tuned during periods of extreme environmental pressure. These systems allow humans to maintain functionality under conditions that would incapacitate other species. Neurological adaptations that emerge during the bottleneck continue to influence human cognition and behavior. The human brain's remarkable plasticity, its ability to reorganize and adapt to new challenges throughout life, may have been enhanced during this period when environmental conditions were constantly changing. This neural flexibility became a defining characteristic of human intelligence and our capacity for cultural learning. The genetic foundations of human language capabilities also show evidence of rapid evolution during or around the bottleneck period. Several genes crucial for language development, including FOXP2 and related regulatory networks, show patterns of recent evolutionary change that coincide with the time frame of the bottleneck. This suggests that the communication demands of surviving in small, scattered groups may have accelerated the evolution of sophisticated language abilities. Human longevity patterns reflect another genetic legacy of the bottleneck. Compared to other primates, humans have unusually long lifespans relative to our body size and reproductive rate. This extended longevity may have been advantageous during the bottleneck when the accumulated knowledge and experience of older individuals was crucial for group survival. The genetic mechanisms that support human longevity may have been selected for during this period. The social cognition genes that underlie human empathy, cooperation, and theory of mind also show signatures of recent evolutionary change. The ability to understand others' mental states, cooperate with non-relatives, and engage in complex social coordination would have been essential for survival in the tiny groups that persisted through the bottleneck. These capabilities became genetically encoded traits that continue to influence human social behavior. Population genetic analysis of modern human mitochondrial DNA reveals additional details about the bottleneck's impact. Mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only through the maternal line, shows a pattern of recent common ancestry that aligns with the nuclear DNA variants for a severe population reduction. The maternal lineages that survived the bottleneck became the ancestors of all modern human mitochondrial diversity. Y chromosome analysis tells a similar story from the paternal perspective. The patterns of Y chromosome variation in modern human populations are consistent with descent from a small number of male lineages that survived the bottleneck. These analyses provide independent confirmation of the nuclear DNA evidence and help refine our understanding of the bottleneck's severity and duration. Epigenetic mechanisms, heritable changes in gene expression that do involve DNA sequence changes may also carry signatures of the bottleneck period. Environmental stresses can create epigenetic modifications that persist for multiple generations, potentially transmitting some of the adaptive responses developed during the crisis to subsequent generations. While this research is still in its early stages, it suggests that the bottleneck's influence on human biology may be even more extensive than previously recognized. The genetic architecture of human intelligence shows patterns that may reflect selection during the bottleneck period. Unlike many traits that are controlled by single genes, intelligence is influenced by thousands of genetic variants, each with small effects. This polygenic architecture may have allowed for rapid evolutionary responses to the cognitive demands of survival during the crisis, as small beneficial mutations could accumulate quickly in small populations. Human genetic variants associated with cold tolerance and adaptation to harsh environments show geographic patterns that may reflect the climate conditions during the bottleneck. Populations in regions that experience the most severe climate changes during this period often carry genetic variants that enhance survival in cold, dry environments. These adaptations may have originated during the bottleneck and spread as populations expanded. The way humans respond to stress, both individually and as groups, may also bear the imprint of the bottleneck period. Our species shows remarkable psychological resilience in the face of extreme adversity, as well as sophisticated mechanisms for social cooperation during crises. These traits may have been shaped by the survival challenges faced by our bottleneck ancestors. Population genetic studies of modern humans continue to reveal new insights about the bottleneck period. As genetic analysis techniques become more sophisticated, researchers are able to detect subtler signals of ancient population events. These studies are gradually filling in the details of how our ancestors survived, recovered, and eventually prospered after their brush with extinction. The genetic legacy of the bottleneck also has important implications for human conservation and survival in the modern world. Understanding how our species survived and recovered from such a severe population reduction provides insights into resilience, adaptation, and the factors that contribute to long-term species survival. These lessons may be increasingly relevant as humans face new global challenges. The study of ancient DNA from fossil remains is beginning to provide direct evidence of genetic changes that occurred during and after the bottleneck period. While DNA preservation from this time period is extremely rare, occasional discoveries are starting to confirm and refine the picture painted by studies of modern genetic diversity. Perhaps most remarkably, the genetic evidence suggests that despite the severe reduction in diversity, The bottleneck may have actually accelerated certain aspects of human evolution. The intense selective pressure created conditions for rapid evolutionary change that might not have occurred under normal circumstances. In essence, our near-extinction may have been a catalyst for the development of the very traits that make us distinctly human. Today, as we face new global challenges including climate change, pandemics, and resource depletion, the genetic legacy of our ancestral bottleneck serves as both a warning and a source of hope. It reminds us that human populations can be far more vulnerable than we often assume, but also that our species possesses remarkable resilience and adaptability forged in the crucible of our most challenging evolutionary trial. Chapter 11. Lessons from the Edge of Extinction. As we stand in the 21st century surrounded by over 8 billion human beings and facing unprecedented global challenges, the story of our ancestors, brush with extinction 900,000 years ago, offers profound lessons about human resilience, vulnerability, and the factors that determine species survival. Their experience provides a unique perspective on what it takes to not just survive catastrophic change, but to emerge stronger and more capable than before. The first and perhaps most important lesson from the bottleneck is the incredible fragility of human existence. Today, there are more than 8 billion human beings on the planet. Our species dominate Earth's landscapes, and our activities are driving large numbers of other species to extinction. Had a researcher looked at the world sometime between 800,000 and 900,000 years ago, however, the picture would have been quite different. This dramatic contrast reminds us that even the most successful species can be reduced to the brink of extinction by environmental changes beyond their control. The speed with which human populations decline during the bottleneck is particularly sobering. The transition from thriving populations of around 100,000 individuals to barely 1,280 breeding pairs happened relatively quickly in geological terms. This demonstrates how rapidly environmental changes can overwhelm even adaptable species when multiple crisis factors combine. Climate change, resource depletion, and ecosystem collapse created a cascade of challenges that nearly proved insurmountable. However, the story also reveals the remarkable power of human adaptability and innovation. The novel finding opens a new field in human evolution because it evokes many questions, such as the places where these individuals lived, how they overcame the catastrophic climate changes, and whether natural selection during the bottleneck has accelerated the evolution of human brain. Co-author and East China Normal University evolutionary and functional genomics expert Yixuan Pan said in a statement, "The survival strategies employed by our ancestors during the bottleneck offer important insights for modern crisis management. Their success depended on several key factors: technological innovation, social cooperation, flexible resource use, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. These same factors remain crucial for human survival in the face of contemporary challenges like climate change, pandemics, and resource scarcity. The importance of maintaining genetic and cultural diversity, even in small populations, cannot be overstated. Despite being reduced to incredibly small numbers, our ancestors managed to preserve enough genetic diversity to fuel their eventual recovery and expansion. This was likely achieved through careful management of breeding relationships, maintenance of connections between scattered groups, and the preservation of crucial cultural knowledge across generations. The role of refugia in species survival is another crucial lesson from the bottleneck period. The small areas where human populations managed to survive the worst of the crisis became the launching points for eventual recovery and expansion. This highlights the importance of identifying and protecting areas that might serve as refugia during future environmental crises, whether for humans or other endangered species. The bottleneck demonstrates the critical importance of long-term thinking and planning in survival strategies. The crisis lasted for over 100,000 years, far longer than any individual human lifespan or even the memory of oral traditions. Yet somehow, the surviving populations maintained the cultural knowledge and behavioral practices necessary for survival across hundreds of generations. This suggests that successful crisis response requires building systems and institutions that can preserve crucial knowledge and practices across extremely long time periods. The paradigm of distributed leadership emerges as another crucial insight from the bottleneck period. With communities scattered across vast territories and communication limited, centralized authority structures would have been impossible to maintain. Instead, each small group needed individuals capable of making life or death decisions independently. This distributed decision-making model, born from necessity during the crisis, may have contributed to the development of human cognitive flexibility and individual initiative that characterizes our species today. The psychological mechanisms developed for coping with prolonged uncertainty represent another critical legacy of the bottleneck. Resource optimization and efficiency principles learned during the bottleneck continue to influence human behavior patterns today. The concept of waste not, want not, isn't merely cultural wisdom. It may represent deeply embedded behavioral programming that developed when every calorie, every tool, and every drop of water could mean the difference between survival and death. Modern human tendencies toward resource conservation, even in times of abundance, may reflect genetic and cultural memories of this period of extreme scarcity. The development of risk assessment and management strategies during the bottleneck period created cognitive frameworks that continue to influence human decision-making. Our ancestors had to constantly evaluate threats and opportunities with limited information, making decisions that could affect not just their own survival, but the survival of their entire genetic lineage. This pressure shaped human cognitive evolution towards sophisticated pattern recognition, probabilistic thinking, and the ability to make complex decisions under uncertainty. The bottleneck period also demonstrates the critical importance of intergenerational knowledge transfer in species survival. With lifespans much shorter than the duration of the crisis, no individual could accumulate enough experience to navigate all the challenges they might face. Instead, survival depended on the effective transmission of accumulated knowledge from older to younger generations. This created selective pressure for enhanced learning abilities, memory capacity, and cultural transmission mechanisms that remain central to human societies today. Innovation under pressure emerges as perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the bottleneck period. Faced with the collapse of traditional survival strategies, our ancestors were forced to develop entirely new approaches to finding food, water, shelter, and safety. The technological innovations that emerged during this period advanced fire control, sophisticated tool technologies, and complex food processing techniques weren't just survival necessities, but represented quantum leaps in human cultural capability. The social innovations developed during the bottleneck were equally transformative. Conflict resolution mechanisms became critically important when group cohesion was essential for survival, but resources were scarce enough to create tension. Systems for fair resource distribution, collective decision-making, and dispute resolution that developed during this period may have laid the foundation for all subsequent human social and political organization. The bottleneck also highlights the importance of mental model flexibility in survival situations. Traditional ways of understanding and interacting with the environment became obsolete as conditions changed rapidly and dramatically. Groups that survived were those that could abandon ineffective mental models and develop new frameworks for understanding their changing world. This cognitive flexibility, the ability to fundamentally restructure one's understanding of reality when circumstances demanded, became a defining characteristic of human intelligence. Network resilience principles learned during the bottleneck continue to influence human social organization. The scattered populations that survived the crisis had to maintain loose but vital connections across vast distances and hostile territory. These early human networks demonstrated principles of redundancy, distributed resources, and multiple communication pathways that modern network theorists recognize as essential for system resilience. The development of contingency planning and scenario modeling during the bottleneck period shaped human cognitive capabilities in profound ways. With survival dependent on preparing for multiple possible futures, our ancestors developed enhanced abilities to imagine hypothetical scenarios, plan for contingencies, and maintain multiple strategies simultaneously. These cognitive capabilities became foundational for all subsequent human cultural and technological development. The role of storytelling and cultural memory in preserving survival knowledge cannot be understated. During the bottleneck, crucial information about resource locations, seasonal patterns, survival techniques, and territorial knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted without written language. This created intense selective pressure for enhanced narrative abilities, memory techniques, and symbolic communication that laid the groundwork for human language and cultural complexity. The bottleneck experience also shaped human emotional and motivational systems in ways that continue to influence our species. The ability to maintain hope and motivation during prolonged hardship, to find meaning in struggle, and to commit to long-term goals despite immediate suffering all became essential psychological adaptations. These emotional capabilities, forged in the crucible of near-extinction, continue to characterize human responses to adversity. Crisis-driven cooperation mechanisms developed during the bottleneck created new models for human social organization. Traditional competitive dynamics had to be suspended when group survival was at stake. The cooperative strategies that emerged, resource sharing, collective labor, mutual aid, and coordinated planning, became templates for human social organization that persist in modern institutions and cultural practices. The bottleneck also demonstrates the critical importance of maintaining cultural and technological diversity even within small populations. Groups that survived were likely those that preserved multiple approaches to solving survival problems rather than converging on single solutions. This principle of maintaining diversity as an insurance against uncertainty continues to influence human cultural and technological development. Environmental monitoring and adaptation strategies developed during the bottleneck shaped human capabilities for observing and responding to environmental change. Our ancestors had to become exquisitely sensitive to environmental indicators, subtle changes in plant behavior, animal movements, weather patterns, and resource availability. This environmental awareness became embedded in human cognitive and cultural capabilities, influencing everything from agricultural practices to modern environmental science. The leadership qualities required during the bottleneck created new models for human authority and governance. Traditional dominance hierarchies based on physical strength or aggression would have been counterproductive when group survival depended on cooperation and collective wisdom. Instead, leadership based on knowledge, decision-making ability, and capacity to inspire cooperation became essential. These alternative leadership models may have contributed to the development of more complex and effective human social organizations. The recovery process that began around 813,000 years ago shows that even severe population bottlenecks can be overcome if the right conditions are met. The fact that the small surviving human population was eventually able to expand across the entire planet demonstrates the incredible potential for recovery that exists when species possess the right combination of biological and cultural adaptations. The technological innovations developed during the bottleneck period became the foundation for all subsequent human cultural development. The mastery of fire, advanced tool-making techniques, and sophisticated survival strategies that were developed under extreme pressure proved to be transformative technologies that enhanced human capabilities far beyond what was necessary for mere survival. This suggests that crisis periods, while dangerous, can also drive innovation and advancement that wouldn't occur under normal circumstances. The social cooperation and coordination required for survival in tiny groups may have been crucial for developing the complex social abilities that characterize modern humans. The bottleneck period forced our ancestors to develop unprecedented levels of cooperation, communication, and collective decision-making. These social innovations became part of our species' cultural and possibly genetic heritage, contributing to our ability to work together on large-scale projects and respond collectively to shared challenges. The bottleneck also demonstrates the importance of maintaining hope and cultural continuity, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. For over 100,000 years, generation after generation of our ancestors was born into a world of scarcity and uncertainty. Yet they continued to innovate, adapt, and preserve their cultural knowledge, eventually creating the conditions for recovery and expansion. This speaks to the remarkable psychological resilience of the human species and our capacity to maintain long-term goals even under extreme stress. Modern conservation efforts can learn important lessons from how our ancestors managed to preserve their populations and diversity through the bottleneck. The careful management of breeding relationships, the maintenance of communication networks between isolated groups, and the preservation of crucial survival knowledge all have relevance for contemporary efforts to save endangered species and preserve genetic diversity. The bottleneck period also highlights the interconnectedness of environmental and biological systems. The climate changes that triggered the crisis affected every aspect of the African ecosystem, from water availability to plant communities to animal populations. Our ancestors' survival depended on understanding and adapting to these interconnected changes rather than focusing on any single environmental factor. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the bottleneck challenges us to think differently about human vulnerability and resilience in the modern world. While we face different challenges than our ancestors, including some of our own making, the basic principles of survival remain the same. The need for adaptability, cooperation, innovation, and long-term thinking. The genetic evidence shows that we are all descendants of those remarkable survivors who refused to surrender in the face of extinction. Their genes, their innovations, and their cultural wisdom live on in every human being alive today. This shared heritage connects all humans to a common story of survival against impossible odds and provides a foundation for addressing the global challenges we face together. The research into the bottleneck also demonstrates the power of modern scientific techniques to uncover previously hidden aspects of our evolutionary history. The ability to read the story of ancient population dynamics from modern DNA represents a remarkable achievement that continues to reveal new insights about human evolution and survival. As we face contemporary challenges including climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion, the lessons from our ancestors' survival through the bottleneck period become increasingly relevant. Their experience shows that even the most severe crises can be overcome through the right combination of innovation, cooperation, and determination. But it also warns us that species survival is never guaranteed, and that we must remain vigilant about the factors that could threaten human civilization. The story of the bottleneck ultimately reminds us that we are part of a continuous chain of survival and adaptation that stretches back nearly 1,000,000 years. Every challenge our ancestors overcame, every innovation they developed, and every adaptation they made contributes to our ability to face the challenges of today and tomorrow. We are the beneficiaries of their remarkable resilience, and we bear the responsibility of ensuring that their legacy of survival continues into the future. As we reach the end of this remarkable journey through humanity's darkest hour, we are left with profound questions about what the bottleneck of 900,000 years ago means for our species' future. The story of our ancestors' survival against impossible odds provides both sobering warnings and inspiring hope for the challenges that lie ahead. The genetic analysis that revealed this ancient crisis demonstrates that human populations can be far more vulnerable than we often assume. The transition from thriving populations to near extinction happened with shocking speed, reminding us that even the most successful species can face existential threats when environmental conditions change rapidly. In our current era of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, this lesson takes on urgent relevance. Yet the story is ultimately one of remarkable triumph. These findings are just the start. Study co-author and Shanghai Institute of Nutrition and Health theoretical population geneticist and computational biologist Li Haipeng said in a statement, "Future goals with this knowledge aim to paint a more complete picture of human evolution during this early to middle Pleistocene transition period, which will in turn continue to unravel the mystery that is early human ancestry and evolution." The fact that we exist today, that over 8 billion humans now inhabit every corner of the planet, is testament to the extraordinary resilience, adaptability, and innovation of our ancestors. From a population smaller than a modern town, humanity not only survived but eventually became the most successful large mammal species on Earth. This recovery represents one of the greatest comeback stories in the history of life. The innovations and adaptations that allowed ancestors to survive became the foundation for everything that makes us human. Our capacity for complex cooperation, technological innovation, and cultural transmission all have their roots in the survival strategies developed during this crisis. The psychological resilience that enabled tiny communities to maintain hope across thousands of generations of hardship continues to characterize our species today. Perhaps most importantly, the bottleneck reminds us that we are all connected by this shared heritage of survival. Every person alive today carries in their genes the legacy of those remarkable individuals who refused to surrender when faced with extinction. This common ancestry transcends all the divisions that separate modern human populations. We are all descendants of the same small group of survivors who persevered through humanity's greatest trial. As we face the challenges of the 21st century and beyond, the lessons from our ancestors' survival remain profoundly relevant. Their experience shows us that even the most severe crises can be overcome through innovation, cooperation, and determination. But it also warns us to remain vigilant about the factors that could threaten our continued survival and prosperity. The story of the bottleneck is ultimately a story about the power of human resilience and the importance of never giving up, no matter how dire the circumstances may seem. It reminds us that survival isn't just about avoiding extinction, it's about emerging stronger, more capable, and better adapted to face whatever challenges the future may hold. We are the inheritors of an incredible legacy of survival against impossible odds. The question now is, what will we do with that inheritance?